Okay, welcome to tonight's session of our lecture series on Stephen Crane's Times. And today's subject will be Jack London, and our presenter is my old friend and colleague John Adams, who said that normally as an introduction he prefers I am John Adams and I used to work here, which, however, is just as caustic as you'd expect from him. And I insist that I'll say a few words more about him. He just gave me these two forks, which actually say USN at the bottom, and that indicates where he spent part of his life, i.e. in the US Navy. And in honor of that, I'm currently wearing my old Navy sweater. We're both Navy veterans. But he's done a lot more sailing than that. He was taken out of high school by his parents and for the next 4 years rounded the world on a sailing vessel. He's also written a novel about that, and he's edited the diaries of his mother, who was the skipper on that trip. So both of them are available from what's the name of your Slackwater Press, preferably online. And okay, I'll leave out everything else, how you got here to Freiburg eventually, and so far inland, and why. But he was a professor here from the 1990s through 2012 when he retired. And he's not as that retired, as you can see from his presentation tonight, and he's certainly the specialist on Jack London, so that's his slot tonight on the show. John Adams.
Thank you, Wolfgang. It's really weird not having an audience. I assume there's 2 or 3 people out there. Say hi. I'd like to begin. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to begin by thanking Professor Hochbrook for giving me this opportunity to talk about Jack London. Let me start by saying what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to introduce Jack London in terms of the importance of his travel experience and his reading. And then I'm going to talk about the accusations that Jack London was an individualist, that he was a racist, and that he was a literary hack. So, Jack London, the greatest story he ever wrote. Where is the camera again? Up there. Where that light is? Yeah. Jack London was a popular writer. His writing derived from a combination of his experience and his reading. Although London was born poor and died at the age of 40, his experience was extensive. London was a traveler. In 1892, just after he turned 17, he sailed on the seal hunting schooner, the Sophia Sutherland, sailing from San Francisco to Japan and the Bering Sea. 2 years later, 1894, London tramped across the United States as a member of Coxey's army of unemployed to protest the conditions of workers. In 1897, after a semester as a student at the University of California, London traveled to Alaska to participate in the Klondike gold rush. In 1902, London traveled to London, England, and spent a month living as an unemployed sailor in the East End, considered to be the worst slums in the world. In 1904, London traveled to Japan and Korea to report on the Russo-Japanese War. In 1907, he sailed on his ketch, the Snark, on a cruise that took him from San Francisco to Hawaii and through the South Seas from the Marquesas Islands to the Solomon Islands. In 1914, he traveled to Vera Cruz as a war correspondent to report on U.S. military intervention in Mexico. All these travels, plus many less notable ones, formed London's experience and fed his writing. The American literary critic Alfred Kazin said that the greatest story Jack London ever wrote was the story he lived. London also read extensively. In a letter to his publisher, he wrote that as a child, he was an omnivorous reader, principally because reading matter was scarce, and I had to be grateful for whatever fell into my hands. He remembered reading Captain Cook's Voyages when he was 7. Later, he discovered the Oakland Public Library, and in order to read as many books as possible, he got library cards for all of his family members and checked out books on their cards as well as his own. He read Greek and Roman classics, Shakespeare, and Milton. When London went to sea on the Sophia Sutherland, he took a sack of books with him, including Tolstoy, Flaubert, and Melville. London read when others slept. When London set sail to sail around the world on the Snark, he took 500 books with him. London also read works of science, philosophy, sociology, including Rousseau, Nietzsche, Marx, William James, and Carl Jung. At the end of his life, London's personal library contained 15,000 books. As a source of ideas, the most important author for London was Charles Darwin. When London traveled to the Klondike to participate in the gold rush, the Canadian Mounted Police required London to carry supplies that would last him 1 year. This worked out to be a ton of equipment and food. London took one book, Darwin's On the Origin of Species. The result of London's experience and reading in the far north is a story that is now a classic in American naturalism, The Call of the Wild. That's a first edition cover, by the way, so you have an idea what books looked like around 1902. The story is about Buck, a domesticated dog who is carried to the far north where environmental forces trigger his atavistic instincts, making him adapt to the far north as he devolves into a wolf. London didn't need a literary model such as Émile Zola for his naturalism. He simply applied his reading of Darwin to his experience of the far north, and naturalism is what came out. London didn't just read Darwin, he studied Darwin. And he studied those who wrote about Darwin, especially Herbert Spencer and Thomas Huxley. Spencer was a social philosopher who coined the phrase, the survival of the fittest. He believed that competition was needed to weed out the inferior members of a group, and he assumed that it operated in the area of ideas and society. This assumption came to justify a lot of racism and rapacious capitalism in the late 19th century. Huxley, on the other hand, was a biologist. He criticized Spencer, pointing out that nature does not offer a model for civilization. Civilization, Huxley pointed out, is like a garden in the middle of nature, and a garden needs to be cultivated. Early on, Spencer's version of Darwin influenced London, but later, Huxley's more humane version became London's model. In his novel The Sea Wolf, 1904, the two main characters discuss Darwin. Wolf Larsen, the Nietzschean figure, accepts Spencer's version of Darwin. The narrator, Humphrey Van Weyden, tells Larsen he has misread Darwin, for Darwin does not sanction your wanton destruction of life. Okay, that was my introduction. Two major biographies. Let's start one more time. A major biography of Jack London begins by saying, no American writer has been subjected to more misleading commentaries than Jack London. I better finish reading that one first. Sometimes these misleading commentaries are the result of a conflict between London's experience and the ideas he acquired from his reading. Sometimes these misleading commentaries are the result of the crude, critical habit of conflating London with his characters, such as the Nietzschean figure Wolf Larsen. And sometimes these misleading commentaries are the result of just plain critical envy. Some critics tried to feed off of London's success by accusing him of plagiarism or ignorance. The President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, called London a nature faker. I'm going to take up 3 of these misleading commentaries, namely that London was an individualist, a racist, and a literary hack. While these labels can be made to fit London, they are in many ways misleading half-truths. For whatever Jack London was as a writer, we need to see him in terms of what he experienced and what he read. Jack London was an individualist, but he wasn't a version of the Nietzschean Übermensch, the blonde beast, the human beast of prey. To call London an Übermensch was to confuse him with one of his fictional characters, Wolf Larsen. Wolf Larsen is London's most unforgettable character, the captain of a seal hunting schooner Ghost in the novel Seawolf. Wolf Larsen tyrannizes the crew of his ship. He is known to have killed a man with a single blow of his fist, and at the same time, he reads Shakespeare, Browning, and Charles Darwin. The first description we get of Larsen is of his primitive strength, a strength savage, ferocious, alive in itself, the essence of life. This strength is the basis of Larsen's behavior. He rules other men with force and brutality, for he says, might makes right. It's not unusual for literary critics to confuse an author with his fictional characters, but London was something of an extreme case. In 1903, a year before The Seawolf was published, London already had a public image of the tough guy. He was aware of this, and in a letter, he describes his popular image. A rough, savage fellow, they will say, who likes prize fights and brutalities, who has a clever turn of the pen, a charlatan smattering of the arts, and the inevitable deficiencies of an untrained, unrefined, self-made man, which he strives with a fair measure of success to hide beneath an attitude of roughness and unconventionality. Do I endeavor to unconvince them? It's so much easier to leave their convictions alone. This image of the rough guy, tough guy, became more extreme with the publication of The Seawolf. London's story of the seal hunting schooner Ghost is based on his experience on the seal hunting schooner Sophia Sutherland. London drew on the cruise, the ship, the crew, the storms at sea in writing his novel. But he did not draw Wolf Larsen from his experience. Wolf Larsen is a literary figure, a figure of London's reading and imagination. Larsen is a figure of literary naturalism, a movement at the end of the 19th century that viewed mankind trapped in a life of hereditary and environmental determinism. When Larsen says what he believes, his description is an example of pure naturalism. I believe that life is a mess. It is like yeast, a ferment, a thing that moves. It may move for a minute, an hour, a year, or 100 years, but in the end will cease to move. The big eat the little, that they may continue to move. The strong eat the weak, that they may retain their strength. The lucky eat the most and move the longest. That is all. This implies that there is no God or transcendental existence, that the world is amoral, that mankind is merely an animal in a struggle for existence. Although Larsen is a naturalistic character, The Seawolf is not entirely a naturalistic novel. The novel as a whole is not a downward spiral ending in death, as in Stephen Crane's Maggie or Frank Norris's McTeague. The main conflict in the novel is not between the character and the environment, as in Maggie, or between the character and his genes, as in McTeague. The conflict in The Seawolf is between Wolf Larsen and Humphrey van Weyden. Larsen dies in the end, but Wolf Larsen is not the protagonist of the novel. He's the antagonist. Van Weyden is the protagonist. Van Weyden is the narrator, and he, rather than Wolf Larsen, speaks for London's idea of individualism. Van Weyden is a clear contrast to Wolf Larsen. Larsen is physically strong with a working class background and the captain of a seal hunting schooner. Van Weyden is physically weak, at the beginning of the novel at least, an upper class gentleman, a literary critic. As the novel begins, he has just published an article on Edgar Allan Poe. Larsen sees Van Weyden as a social parasite. Van Weyden is a gentleman who lives on the income that his father earned. Larsen says, "You stand on dead man's legs." Of course, it's not likely that Van Weyden would willingly sail on the Ghost to hunt seals in the Bering Sea. To get Van Weyden on the Ghost, London uses that major plot device known as chance. Van Weyden was on a ferry crossing the Golden Gate to San Francisco in a thick fog when the ferry boat was rammed by another boat. Van Weyden is knocked overboard and carried out to sea in the ebbing tide. Just before Van Weyden is about to give in to exhaustion, Wolf Larsen sees him from the deck of his schooner, puts a boat over the side, and rescues him. Van Weyden offers $1,000 to be put ashore, but Wolf Larsen makes Van Weyden a counteroffer to sign on as the ship's cabin boy. Wolf Larsen says, "It will be the making of you." That is, it will make Van Weyden a real man. Of course, Larsen doesn't give Van Weyden any choice. Larsen is headed across the Pacific. He has no intention of turning back to San Francisco. Besides, his first mate has just died, and he's short one man. In fact, Wolf Larsen is right. The cruise of the Ghost is the making of Van Weyden. And this making of Van Weyden is the major plot development in the novel. Van Weyden slowly becomes a competent sailor, competent enough for Larsen to make Van Weyden his first mate. Toward the end of the novel, the Ghost is dismasted in a storm and runs aground on an island off of Alaska. Van Weyden manages to hoist the mast back into the schooner, re-rig the mast, and patch the sails. In doing this, he has to figure out a number of physical puzzles. How to lift the masts out of the water and onto the deck, how to hoist the masts upright and step them in the deck again. While doing this, he says to himself, I'm learning. This is London's idea of individualism. A man who can learn to overcome adversity, who can adapt to his environment and master it. Brute strength is not enough. Brute strength could not raise the masts and set them back in the schooner. London signals to the reader that Van Weyden is his idea of individualism. For in the end, Larsen dies and Van Weyden sails home. Plus, there's a woman in the story, and it is Van Weyden, rather than Wolf Larsen, who wins the woman. For London, this is more than a happy ending. Early in the story, Van Weyden diagnoses Larsen's problem. Larsen is isolated. He has no one to associate with or even talk to. For London, this is Darwin's implicit critique of the Nietzschean Übermensch. The man who is isolated, the man who fails to get the woman, is a man who fails to reproduce himself. He represents an evolutionary dead end. The first edition of The Sea Wolf has a number of drawings. Here is one of them. You can see that's Van Weyden shouting at a passing ship that he offers $1,000 to be put ashore. In the foreground, lying on deck, is the dead first mate. And in the background, on the right, by the mainmast, is Wolf Larsen with his crew behind him. Even so, London's idea of individualism was in some ways contradictory, mainly because London was also a committed socialist. He learned his socialism through his experience, through working in factories for starvation wages, tramping with the unemployed, living in the slums of London. For London, individualism was for himself. He could handle it. Socialism was for everybody else, those who couldn't pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. Racism. In 1893, Frederick Jackson Turner delivered his well-known address, The Significance of the Frontier in American History. Turner begins his address by saying the American frontier is closed. Turner describes the frontier in two ways, as population density and as the meeting point between savagery and civilization. A significant amount of racism is embedded in that expression, savagery and civilization. And a significant amount of what critics see in London's racism derives from his experience of where this so-called savagery and civilization rubbed up against each other. Because in the years from years 1890 to 1910, the frontier still existed in the far north, in Alaska and the Yukon, and it still existed in the South Seas, in Polynesian and Melanesian islands. In his writing, we see London fascinated with the idea of civilization and savagery because he experienced it firsthand. Also in 1893, American businessmen overthrew the Hawaiian monarchy and set the Hawaiian Islands on the road to become a U.S. imperial colony. In 1907, while he was in Hawaii, London wrote the story, The House of Pride, which is about the relationship between Americans and Hawaiians. The protagonist of the story is Percival Ford, the descendant of New England missionaries. Note at the time, the New England Missionary Society always insisted that a missionary marry before he went out to the Pacific Islands. The antagonist of the story is Joe Garland, who was what the Hawaiians called a hapa haole, or half white, and what the whites call half Kanaka. In Hawaiian, Kanaka originally simply meant Hawaiian, but whites appropriated the word and used it to mean any South Pacific Islander, often in a derogatory sense. The plot of the story turns on Percival Ford discovering that Joe Garland is his Hawaiian half-brother. And more than that everyone else in the islands knew that Joe Garland was his half-brother. Percival is distressed to discover that his father, the New England missionary, had unruly blood. Percival, who was born and raised in Hawaii, has such a sense of racial superiority and such a belief in racial purity that he cannot accept his Hawaiian half-brother. So he banishes Joe. He gives him money and sends him to California and tells him never to return. As the story suggests, when London writes about race and the relationship between races, he doesn't always write about the superiority of the white race and the inferiority of non-whites. Percival, the son of New England parents, is clearly a weak and unsympathetic character. Today, the story may seem somewhat trite, but at the time London wrote the story, it hit a nerve in America because the story was a reflection of a major political debate at the time. In 1898, the United States annexed Hawaii as part of the claims it made after the Spanish-American War, in which it annexed Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. On the one hand, the political debate was about American imperialism. On the other hand, it was about the issue of race. A senator from South Carolina complained that the annexation of islands in the Pacific and Caribbean was bringing tens of millions of colored race into the body politic of the United States. In this context of imperialism and racism, London's story was turned down by 20 magazines over a period of 3 years. London finally sold it to the Pacific Monthly for far less than what he was usually paid. In turn, when London collected his Hawaiian stories in 1912, he made The House of Pride the lead story in the book, The House of Pride and Other Hawaiian Stories. Although the protagonist and not London is the racist figure in the House of Pride, I'm not going to claim that London himself was not racist. London was self-educated. His reading was constant and wide-ranging, and he wanted to be accepted as an intellectual. As a result, he often adopted the ideas of scientific racism that was popular among intellectuals of his time. He read, as I pointed out, Herbert Spencer, who coined the phrase, the survival of the fittest. In the essay, The Salt of the Earth, published in Anglo-American magazine in 1902, London wrote, "So it must be granted that the Anglo-Saxon is a race of mastery and achievement. It has done things, it is doing things, and is the worker and doer today who is best fitted for survival." In the essay, London writes a lot about the greatness of the Anglo-Saxon race in contrast to other races, not just African and Asian, but also European races, such as the French. But London's views on race were split between these general ideas that he derived from his reading and the characters in his short stories that he derived from his experience, especially the people of the South Pacific. So it is in his short stories that we see a more nuanced view of race. For when London writes about the South Pacific, race is always an issue, though not always the most important one. In his nonfiction, London bought into the ideology of racism in its two major forms: the superiority of the white race and the degeneracy of mixed races. But his fiction tends to contradict this ideology because his experience did. When London sailed the Snark into Nukuhiva in the Marquesas Islands of French Polynesia, 1907, he anticipated repeating Herman Melville's adventures in the Valley of Typee. But his first disappointment occurred when he went ashore and discovered that the Marquesan are perishing, and those that still survive seem to be all half-breeds and strange conglomerations of dozens of different races. There are more races than there are persons, but it is a wreckage of races at best. London then proceeds with a short discussion on natural selection and his belief in the superiority of the white race, the fit, the ones best constituted to live in the world of hostile microorganisms. Race looms large in London's writing, but race wasn't the only characteristic he wrote about. For London, a character's competency, his ability to master his environment, was more important than race. And a basic symbol of competency for London is an individual's ability to sail a boat. London's appreciation of sailing is the result of his experience. At the age of 12, he bought a 14-foot skiff and taught himself to sail. In 1891, when he was 16, London bought the 26-foot sloop Razzle Dazzle and became an oyster pirate on the San Francisco Bay. In 1893, London sailed on the three-masted schooner, the Sophia Sutherland, from San Francisco to the Bering Sea and back. In 1903, he bought the 38-foot sloop Spray and spent days sailing on the San Francisco Bay. In 1906, London had the 55-foot ketch Snark built and sailed her from San Francisco to as far as the Solomon Islands. In 1910, London bought the 30-foot yawl, Romer, and spent days sailing the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta. In 1911, while on board Romer, London wrote the article Small Boat Sailing, which begins, "A sailor is born, not made." In this sense, London saw being a sailor as intrinsic to a character as his race, an idea we see being played out in his collection of South Sea Tales. Show you some of the boats. That's the Sophia Sutherland, three-masted schooner. It's somewhere between 130, 150 feet. Had a crew probably of about 20. The Spray, the sloop, the Snark. I have to point out that And reading London's biographies, you'll often hear that the Snark is a 45-foot ketch. That is referring to the waterline length. Boats are normally referred to by their overall length, which is their deck length. The Snark is 55 feet. And the Roamer. South Sea Tales. In the story, The Seed of McCoy, London shows that seamanship is more important than race in his conception of character. McCoy is a Pitcairn Islander, a descendant of bounty mutineers and Tahitians, making him, in London's view, a half-breed. But McCoy is one of London's most competent characters, a man who has mastered his environment. He's a mariner who has internalized the geography and conditions of the sea. McCoy doesn't refer to a chart, use a sextant, or read a compass. McCoy stands in contrast to Davenport, the captain of the sailing ship Pyrenees. The Pyrenees is carrying a cargo of wheat, which has been on fire for 2 weeks. Davenport has battened down the hatches in an attempt to smother the fire long enough to beach the ship and save its valuable iron hull. However, when McCoy comes aboard, he informs Davenport that there's no beach on Pitcairn Island, but there's a good beach on Mangareva Island, 300 miles to the west. There's no real conflict between McCoy and Davenport. Instead, there's a clear division of nautical labor. As McCoy says, he's a pilot, not a navigator. It is Davenport's task to get the Pyrenees to the island. Once there, McCoy's task is to pilot her through the pass in the reef, around the coral heads in the lagoon, and onto a soft, sandy beach. Davenport is under extreme pressure. The deck of his ship gets hotter each day as the fire threatens to break out. The crew is on short rations and on the verge of mutiny. And now, as the Pyrenees heads into the Tuamotu Islands with their dangerous and unpredictable currents, navigation becomes difficult. Davenport misses Mangareva Island. Then he misses the next 4 islands downwind as he is overcome in a sense of hopelessness. He sat down and buried his face in his hands. Throughout this, McCoy remains serene, pacifies the mutinous crew, and as Davenport misses each island, McCoy describes the next one downwind. He names over 20 islands in all, indicating where they are, whether they are suitable for beaching the ship. When the Pyrenees finally reaches Vacareva Island, McCoy takes command and pilots her through the pass in the reef. At this point, the fire explodes, blowing a hole in the deck. The scene becomes apocalyptic as the fire spreads to the rigging and sails, and the crew abandons ship in a panic. But McCoy never falters. He continues to give commands to Davenport at the helm as he pilots the ship through the lagoon and onto the beach. Near the end of the story, Davenport's subordination to McCoy becomes explicit as Davenport becomes aware of his own unworthiness and smallness in the presence of this other man. For London, writing was a process of trying out ideas. For example, he liked to take an idea and try it out from a different perspective. We see this in The Call of the Wild and its companion piece, White Fang. The Call of the Wild is about a domesticated dog becoming a wolf, and White Fang is the opposite idea of a wolf becoming a domesticated dog. In his Tales of the South Pacific, after telling the story of McCoy, the half-breed who is competent, London turns the idea around and tells the story of the American who is incompetent. But this version of the incompetent seaman is complicated by London's experience of European imperialism. In The Bright Sun of the South Pacific, London encountered his own version of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Like Conrad, London saw the white man's imperialist greed, how white men used cheap trade goods and contract labor to legally enslave blacks, a practice in the South Pacific called blackbirding. And above all, he saw that the white man's sense of racial superiority made him, in the end, the superior savage. London created a character type for the imperialist in the Melanesian Islands. He called this character the inevitable white man. In the story, The Terrible Solomons, he writes, "A man needs only to be careful and lucky to live a long time in the Solomons, but he must also be of the right sort. He must have the hallmark of the inevitable white man stomped upon his soul. He must be inevitable. He must have a certain grand carelessness of odds, a certain colossal self-satisfaction, and a racial egotism that convinces him that one white man is better than 1,000 Kanakas any day of the week, and that on Sunday he's able to clean out 2,000 Kanakas. For such are the things that have made the white man inevitable." In 1899, Kipling wrote the poem The White Man's Burden, urging the United States to take control of the Philippine Islands. London rephrased Kipling and called the imperial enterprise in the South Pacific the white man's mission. Unlike Kipling, London was being ironic because the white man's mission was motivated by greed. For London, the white man who was to fulfill this mission was, of course, the inevitable white man. In the story called The Inevitable White Man, London personifies this imperialist character. The inevitable white man is called Saxe Torf, and aside from being a Yankee, he has two distinguishing characteristics. He's a good shot. Lost my place. He's a good shot and an incompetent sailor. He displays his shooting ability one day when the Duchess, a schooner blackbirding in Solomons, is attacked by an overwhelming number of islanders. The Solomon Islanders kill the entire crew except the captain and Saxe Torf, and they have knocked the captain on the head and are about to behead him when Saxe Torf goes into action. After climbing up the mainmast to the cross trees with 2 rifles and sufficient ammunition, Saxe Torf commences to shoot the islanders. He shoots them all. The astounding thing was the rapidity of his fire. Also, he never made a miss. If ever anything was inevitable, that man was. What this story and others like it makes clear is that however savage the islanders are, and London hardly ever mentions them without also mentioning the practices of cannibalism and headhunting, the inevitable white man with his firearms is the superior savage. Within the context of London's ideology, this is made clear by the fact that once the shooting is over, Saxe Torf was once more the stupid lubber. After shooting the islanders, he's unable to hoist the sails and get the schooner underway. When the captain comes to after fainting from his head wound, he tells Saxe Torf to gather together the wounded islanders lying on the deck. Only then, with a gun in his hand, is Saxe Torf able to get the schooner under sail. Saxe Torf's lack of seamanship is so inherent that it becomes a strong comment on his inevitability. His lack of seamanship points to the fact that he is not one of London's individualists. He is not a Wolf Larsen, and he is not a Van Weyden, because unlike Van Weyden, Saxe Torf is unable to learn seamanship. In the captain of the Duchess description of him, Saxe Torf becomes a figure of ridicule. The captain says, "I never dared risk him at the wheel when we were running in a big sea. While full and by and close and by were insoluble mysteries. Could never tell the difference between a sheet and a tackle, simply couldn't. Tell him to slack off the main sheet, and before you know it, he had dropped the peak. He fell overboard 3 times and he couldn't swim." The inevitability of the white man is not the result of any racial superiority. Rather, it is the result of imperial greed and modern technology. Polynesian woman, this is to give my voice a rest, wearing the traditional periu. By the way, these are London's photographs. He was a photographer. I have some more photos at the end of the talk to show you. And this is a Melanesian man from the Solomons. Okay. The literary hack. London was considered a literary hack, at least in part, because on a number of occasions he said he wrote for money. Since London was born poor, writing was his only source of income, and he wrote continually. He wrote 1,000 words a day, 6 days a week. There's an anecdote that indicates the critic's attitude toward London's writing. It goes like this. London wrote 1,000 words a day and then read over what he had written. If it was good, he sent it to his publisher, and if it was not good, he sent it to his publisher. The belief among critics is that if a writer wrote as much as London, and he wrote 50 books before the age of 40, if a writer wrote as much as London, then he couldn't be good writing. One complaint about London's writing is that he wrote adventure stories. London was, as one critic said, a boy's author. There's a lot of adventure in London's stories, mainly because he led an adventurous life. But only a few of his stories are purely adventure stories, such as his Captain Grief series. Stories about how Captain Grief brings justice to the South Pacific frontier by tracking down crooks, thieves, and murderers. But even these stories have more to them than the stories of a true popular literary hack, like London's contemporary Edgar Rice Burroughs. In 1912, Burroughs published Tarzan of the Apes, a true adventure story for boys. London wrote about the South Pacific because he had been there. Burroughs had never been to Africa. London knew how to sail a boat. It's not likely that Burroughs knew how to swing from tree to tree the way Tarzan does. As an adventure story, Tarzan of the Apes is a collection of worn-out romantic cliches. For example, when Jane, the heroine, is threatened by an ape or a lion, Tarzan is there to rescue her. But when Tarzan's not there, well, Jane has to rescue herself. London never wrote such silliness. Ideas form most of London's ideas. He wrote about evolution, socialism, racism, imperialism, and of course, civilization and savagery. London often combined in a single story ideas. For example, in a story called South of the Slot, he combines evolution and socialism. South of the Slot is about the relation between the rich and poor and labor unrest in San Francisco. The so-called slot is Market Street. North of Market Street is the business district. And south of Market Street is where the factories and the working class live. An actual photograph of the slot. The main character is Freddie Drummond, professor of sociology, and he's one of the few people who can move back and forth across the slot. Professor Drummond goes south of the slot to gather material for his books on the working class. As he spends more time with the working class, he begins to take on a new identity, the identity of the union worker, Bill Tots. Robert Louis Stevenson was one of the many writers who influenced London, and in the story South of the Slot, we see London taking up the doppelganger motif in Stevenson's, that Stevenson uses in The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Like Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde, London's Professor Drummond and Bill Tots are extreme opposites. Drummond doesn't drink, smoke, or dance, and he believes in law and order, that is, the rights of business. Bill Tots likes to drink, smoke, and dance, and he believes in the rights of labor and the use of strikes to acquire that labor, those rights. But London doesn't use a gimmick like a potion to transform his character from professor to union worker. Instead, the professor is transformed into a union worker through the evolutionary forces of adaptation. And as in The Call of the Wild, the forces of adaptation evoke in the character his atavistic and innate nature. The character becomes what London calls a man-beast, a worker who has to fight for his rights. South of the Slot was a popular story, and it was included in literary anthologies until the early 1950s. With the rise of McCarthyism and America's inability to distinguish socialism from communism, London's story was considered too radical. London consciously worked at becoming an author. He already had a capacity for hard work, and he already had a subject, what he called his philosophy of life. What London needed to learn was the literary techniques of successful writers. So he studied the works of contemporary writers, such as the major American writers, Mark Twain, William Dean Howells, and Henry James. What London learned from these writers was the major technical innovations of realist writing, such as an emphasis on action and dialogue and the manipulation of point of view. Once London mastered these technical innovations, he began to sell his stories. And when he became a successful writer, he was generous enough to tell aspiring writers what he had learned. When a young aspiring writer asked how to write a story about the adventures of hobo life, London replied, sticky paper. London writes, "Don't tell the reader the philosophy of the road. Don't tell the reader. Don't. But have your characters tell it by their deeds, actions, talk, etc. Then, and not until then, are you writing fiction and not a sociological paper." In the simplest terms, London expresses the major technical innovation of realist writing, the difference between showing and telling. Showing is the technique of unfolding the story through the experience of the character. Telling is the narrator telling the story. That is, telling is the narrator talking. As Mark Twain put it, "Don't just say the old lady screamed. Bring her on and let her scream." In the story, To Build a Fire, London switches from telling to showing. The story takes place in the far north, above the Arctic Circle. As the story begins, a man is walking from one camp to another. It's a cold day, more than 50 degrees below zero. But the man, the narrator tells us, doesn't know what more than 50 degrees below zero signifies. Then London shows us what it signifies. The man chews tobacco, and when he spits the tobacco juice out, he's startled. He spat speculatively. There was a sharp, explosive crackle that startled him. He spat again, and again in the air. Before it could fall to the snow, the spittle crackled. He knew that at 50 below, spittle crackled on the snow, but this spittle crackled in the air. The entire story is a lesson in what more than 50 degrees below zero signifies. I think that more than any other American realist, William Dean Howells uses dialogue to reveal or show his characters. As one critic of Howells has written, "It is not that there's too much dialogue, which is uniformly excellent, but there is too little of anything else." London's use of dialogue is not so dominating as Howells, but London uses dialogue as Howells did to reveal or show his characters. Let me take up again the story, The House of Pride. The story ends with a dialogue between Percival and his half-brother Joe. "How much will you take to leave the islands and never come back?" Percival demanded. "Never come back?" Joe says. "It is the only land I know. Other lands are cold. I don't know other lands. I have many friends here. In other lands, there'll be no one voice to say, 'Aloha, Joe, my boy.'" "I said, never come back," Percival Ford reiterated. "The Alameda sails tomorrow for San Francisco." Joe Garland is bewildered. "But why?" he says. "You know now that we are brothers." "That is why," was the answer. As you yourself said, everybody knows. I will make it worth your while." The dialogue shows what the banishment of Joe Garland means to both Joe and Percival. Joe is a Hawaiian, and Hawaii is his home, so banishment means his loss of place in the world. Percival Ford is the son of a New England missionary, a white man, and his pride in race refuses to acknowledge his half-brother. This is not the narrator telling us about the characters, but the characters revealing themselves. Realist writers sometimes manipulate the point of view to create a contrast between the characters and the action in the story. In What Maisie Knew in 1897, for example, Henry James uses a child as a narrative point of view. The child observes the actions of the adults around her, but she doesn't always understand what she sees. London uses a similar narrative technique in the story Chinago. The story is told from the point of view of Ah Cho, a Chinese coolie on the plantation in Tahiti. The story opens in a court scene in which Ah Cho is accused of killing another coolie. Ah Cho doesn't understand French, so he doesn't know what's being said in the court, but he thinks the French are stupid because it's taking them so long to realize that he didn't kill anyone. Ah Cho thinks about his future life when he finishes his work contract and goes back to China as a rich man. The court condemns Ah Cho to death, and Ah Cho thinks the French are being particularly stupid, but he assumes they will eventually get it straightened out. As Ah Cho is being brought to the guillotine, he thinks about his future house, its garden, the high wall he will build around it, so he can contemplate a life in peace. At this point, as Ah Cho stands on the scaffold, the French gendarme and the German plantation overseer realizes they have made a mistake. They have the wrong man. But then they decide that it's easier to guillotine Ah Cho than to correct their mistake. At the very last, Ah Cho knows he's about to be beheaded. And in that moment, he caught a last glimpse of his garden. The contrast between the point of view and the action makes for a dominant irony in the story and drives home both the racism and the failure of one cultural group to understand another. The emphasis on showing over telling resulted in a major change in how fiction is read. When the narrator tells the reader about the characters and the action in the story, the reader doesn't have to do much mental work because the narrator does it for the reader. But when the narrator shows the reader what characters say and do, then the reader has to do his or her own thinking because the narrator withdraws from the story, leaving the reader to his or her own devices. As a result, writers who use realist techniques are sometimes misunderstood because the narrator is not there to guide them. London complained of this, of being misunderstood, on a number of occasions. For example, in a letter London wrote in 1915, he makes explicit that Wolf Larsen is a critique of the Nietzschean Übermensch, rather than a glorification. He wrote, "I have again and again written books that failed to get across. Long years ago, at the very beginning of my writing career, I attacked Nietzsche and his Superman idea. That was in The Sea Wolf. In 1951, the Port of Oakland created Jack London Square in an attempt to rehabilitate the Oakland waterfront. This is what it looked like in 1954. That's a 1949 Buick. The square is now a popular tourist attraction, which includes stores, restaurants, hotels, Amtrak station, San Francisco Bay Ferry Dock, and the historic First and Last Chance Saloon, which you see in the photo, where London spent some of his youth as an oyster pirate. Now there is a petition to change the name of Jack London Square to Bobby Seale Plaza. Bobby Seale was the co-founder of the Oakland Black Panthers. Of course, this is part of the current demand for renaming buildings and pulling down statues. And with historical figures like Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln being accused of racism, Jack London doesn't have much chance of escaping this demand for renaming. The major evidence for London's racism, though, is a story called The Unparalleled Invasion. The story is part of London's speculative fiction, where the events of the story take place in the future. The Unparalleled Invasion is the story of world genocide and annihilation of the Chinese civilization. Critics have read different messages of what they believe London was trying to get across. But it seems to me that what London was trying to get across is that there will probably be a future conflict between China and the West, and that the West is so afraid of China that it can think of nothing but killing Chinese. In other words, the story is about the West as a type of international, inevitable white man. In any case, as a critic of London and race has pointed out, one reason we read London today is that he was consumed by questions of race, character, and identity, and did not pretend to solve those questions. Thank you. In case anyone has some questions, we have time because I'm going to show a few photos. Here's a photo of London taking a photo of the building of the Snark. You can see he's holding a camera. This is a number 3 folding pocket Kodak camera built between 1900 and 1915. Another picture, again, you see his camera there below his hands. He's in Korea. He's being inspected by Japanese officers. Here's a photo London took of Korean refugees. Now notice these are digitalized photos of film, which have then been put on the internet, which I've copied, which are now being displayed. It's pretty clear, but the clarity of these photos is incredible. The film was 120 millimeter, which means the film, the negatives are about the size of a postcard. Photo London took in London of the soup line. Again, the clarity is incredible. Notice there's only men there. But in the next one, homeless women in London, 1901. Homelessness is not a new problem. Or as the British call it, those who sleep rough. London was living just north of San Francisco when the earthquake of 1906 occurred, and he went down and he took numerous photographs. Here's one of houses that were not consumed by the fire. This is a photo of Polynesians in Nukuhiva and the Marquesas Islands with London's phonograph. He liked to listen to opera at sea. These guys don't look too weak to me, by the way. Tahitian woman, this is what happens when the Tahitians, when the missionaries got a hold of them, they had to wear Mother Hubbards. And the island next to Tahiti, Moorea, that's Cook's Bay. Can people ask questions, or?
Well, we can. Well, then that they would have to post the link, and that hasn't happened so far. You said that he used this record player and photograph. Did he get recorded? Are there?
I didn't come across anything of that. He held, as you may know, he was a socialist. He held numerous speeches. He ran for mayor of Oakland on the assumption that he would not be elected. He was just a figurehead. But whether he was ever recorded, I have not come across that. I don't think he saw himself as an explorer, not really. Every place he went, the most exotic place he went was the Solomon Islands. And of course, there were white men already there capturing blacks to work on plantations elsewhere. No, as an explorer, not really. He was an adventurer. What's particularly interesting for me about London is he was very working class. He worked in a factory for 10 cents an hour at one time to earn money for the family. And when he became a writer, he became famous. He was the most famous American writer of his time. He was the most highly paid writer. He was the first writer to earn $1 million writing, which today would be over $30 million. But he never participated in literary life. He never met other major writers. Even Frank Norris, who lived in San Francisco at the same time, he never met. He wasn't interested in middle-class life and literary life. He wrote, and he was a competent writer. He wanted to be competent, but he wrote to make money. Right? When he was at sea on the Snark, he wrote his 1,000 words in the morning. Everybody had to be quiet. And then the rest of the day, he read, listened to opera and things like that. But he was not an aesthete. He was not, somebody who talked about the glories of beauty and craftsmanship. For him, it was a job. He just happened to be good at it. Probably more than anything else, he was impatient. He couldn't handle life at Berkeley, at University of California. He couldn't deal with these middle class, upper class colleagues. He couldn't connect with them socially.
Did he try?
There's a funny anecdote which I really enjoy. He tried at one point. He went into the gym where there was some boxing, and he wanted to box this younger freshman who was smaller than him. And London went in there and just annihilated this poor kid. And then an upperclassman came and said, that really wasn't fair. This guy's much smaller than you. He says, why don't you box me? And this upperclassman turned out to be on the boxing team. And he was a good boxer, which London wasn't. He was just one of these guys who went like this. And this upperclassman knocked London flat. And they said London just got up, didn't even take the gloves off, got out of the ring and left with the gloves still on, and never came back. He didn't know how to, to deal. He was used to, guys in bars and taverns and stuff, and saloons, lower class, working class, seamen.
Scrapping rather than boxing. He never met Stephen Crane, did he? Crane never went to the West Coast, as far as I can tell.
Plus he didn't travel much later after. Yeah, I think Crane was dead by the time he went east.
Yeah, Crane was dead by 1900, had left the country by 1897, and Twain, of course, was living at the other end of the country.
I mean, one of the nice contrasts, if you think about it, the time, London was born within 2 years of Gertrude Stein in the same place, San Francisco. Now, Gertrude Stein was middle class, upper middle class. And London went west. Gertrude Stein went east to Paris, was a literary figure. She had she knew everybody between 1900 and 1930. She knew everybody. London was just the reverse. He went to Solomon Islands. There was no literary scene there.
Did he have the ambition to become a famous writer?
No.
It was just for the money, and he didn't run for any awards or anything.
you've heard about people talking about the great American novel. He made fun of that. He had no desire to write the great American novel. In other words, he didn't have this literary ambition. He wanted to write well because he wanted to sell. And you see that some of his writing is very uneven because he acquired very early The Children of the Snow, I think it is, where he wrote his best Tales of the Far North around 1902. He acquired a very high level of sophistication in writing, and that was it. He always trying out new ideas and stuff, but he never became experimenting in the way the modernists did. He was always writing stories to sell, not to show, not to explore the literary world. Although he wrote a lot of, he has a whole section, 50 books, he has a whole section of speculative science fiction writing. I couldn't work that into this. It was already an hour long. But he's got one story, it's called The Red One in the Solomons, in which you have a combination of science fiction, there's this big red object from outer space, and headhunting in the same story. It's a crazy combination.
He also writes one sort of uptake of Edgar Allan Poe, The Scarlet Plague, which got some attention recently when we had a new pandemic.
I don't think it's more of a take on The Last Man, actually, because the Scarlet Plague ends with the death of everybody, whereas the Dance of the Red Mask, I think it is.
Mask of the Red Mask.
Yeah. Whereas London's story begins, it's post-apocalyptic. It begins after the plague has killed most of mankind and what life is like. It's an interesting story. It's a longish, short story.
Yeah, just so dystopian text, kind of uncharacteristic. Martin Eden and what was the one? I've got one London first edition, and that's The Abysmal Brute. Yeah, that one.
Really? I've never even heard of it. The Abysmal Brute. Yeah. Well, not everything he wrote was great.
No, definitely not.
But he had a very fertile imagination. A lot of, as I said, speculative science fiction.
Upton Sinclair claimed he was paid by London to develop plots so London could write more stories.
Well, there's two sides to that. The other side is that London was trying to help Upton Sinclair without just giving him a handout. I paid $50 for something like 5 or 6 plot summaries. But even so, one of the criticism of London is that he wrote so much. He used to go through newspapers to find plots.
Mm-hmm.
And people criticized him for that. He said, what do you mean? I take ideas from everywhere. I write fiction. It's not plagiarism to take ideas from the newspaper. But he was famous and criticized quite a bit, as most famous people are.
What's your position on his supposed suicide versus?
That was completely a fabrication by what was his name, Stone, who wrote the Sailor on Horseback. He wrote the suicide, complete fabrication, in order to sell more. Obviously, he did die of suicide. London was drank. He drank a lot. You can see that. He admitted it. He wrote one of his 2 semi-autobiographies is John Barleycorn.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about his drinking. And he, from what I've been able to determine, he had a very bad diet. He had perfected a particular recipe which was called the 12-minute duck. That is, a duck that was cooked for 12 minutes and still bloody. And, and he ate those. It's sort of what happens when somebody really poor suddenly becomes rich, and they just eat garbage because they can afford it. He had a very bad diet. For example, one thing interesting, the cruise of the Snark ended in the Solomon Islands because of London's health, and he was taken to Australia where he was operated on. But his wife, Sharmina, she suffered very little, although she was there with him the whole time. So it had to do with his drinking and his diet, I'm pretty sure. And then, of course, after he was operated on in Australia, they gave him morphine. And he was taking morphine until the end of his life. He had all kinds of physical problems. But it's unlikely that he committed suicide.
Yeah, it sounds more like kidney failure.
Well, that was the official, that's what was on his death certificate. It was massive organ failure that killed him. But Stone, I can't think of his first name, who wrote the Sailor on Horseback. It's one of those atrocious things. It's the same thing happened to Poe, remember?
Oh.
You take a famous writer and you use his fame to promote yourself. Not the first time. So we done here?
Yep.
Thank you. Stay healthy.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Next week we'll have, it's either Sammy Ludwig or Philipp Schweighauser, but I forget now what the schedule is, but thank you for listening today or whenever you're going to watch this, and more next week.